welcome to our deep dive into the origins of some very familiar Indian ideas. Ideas you may have heard of, like caste,
Yeah.
karma, reincarnation. You've given us some fascinating excerpts from a scholarly text on Indian thought as a starting point.
All right.
And let's unpack all of this with expert speaker.
Great to be here. I think you'll be surprised by how some of these ideas first took shape.
Okay.
You know, we tend to think of India as this timeless place,
Yeah.
but these concepts actually evolved over centuries. So we'll be focusing on the earliest layers, the Vedic hymns and Brahmanas, to see how these beliefs first emerged.
I'm ready to have my mind blown. So the source material mentions this idea that the caste system has always been part of Indian society. Is that a myth?
It is. One of the biggest misconceptions about India
Right.
is that the caste system has always been there. It actually emerged after a major historical event, the Aryan migration into northwest India around 1500 BCE.
Okay, area migration. So these were the Indo-European people who spoke Sanskrit,
That's right.
the language that's related to Greek and Latin.
Exactly. And this migration is crucial for understanding how the caste system came about.
Right.
Before the Aryans arrived, there was no such system in place.
So how did this migration lead to such a rigid social structure?
Well, it's a complex story, but
You're telling me these migrants basically created a system that has impacted Indian society for centuries.
they did. The Aryans believed their religion promised a much better afterlife than the indigenous beliefs.
Okay.
And this created a divide made worse by racial prejudice.
So a spiritual hierarchy layered on top of the existing social order.
Yeah.
What were these distinct castes that emerged?
The Aryans had three main castes: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas.
Okay.
Brahmins were priests and teachers, Kshatriyas were warriors and rulers, and Vaishyas were merchants, farmers, and craftspeople.
Okay.
And they were considered twice born because of a special initiation where
Interesting.
they started studying the Vedas, their sacred scriptures,
Right.
under a Brahmin teacher.
That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
It was like a spiritual coming of age then.
You could say that. They were taught their dharma, their duties in life.
Okay.
Dharma included both moral duties and those specific to their caste.
Interesting.
Imagine their sacred texts were like their moral compass and their social rule book rolled into one.
Whoa. Following your dharma meant a blissful afterlife with the gods.
Yes.
No wonder that system was so appealing. What about the people already living in India before the Aryans?
Right.
Where do they fit in?
Sadly, the non-Aryans were called Shudras,
Okay.
and they weren't allowed to study the Vedas or participate in the same religious life as the twice-born. They were relegated to being laborers and servants,
Ah, so they were
basically at the bottom of the social ladder.
at the bottom.
And later, another group emerged, the untouchables, who were completely ostracized. Even contact with them was considered taboo.
So this system, though rigid, wasn't static.
Right.
It actually evolved over time.
Exactly. The source points out that there was always some social mobility happening in reality.
Okay.
People found ways to bend the rules, even if they couldn't officially change their caste.
That makes sense. No system can be completely airtight,
Right.
especially over such a long period.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this caste system emerging. How do karma and reincarnation fit into all of this?
This is where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay.
Those concepts weren't around in the earliest written records of Indian culture, which is the Rig Veda. What's amazing is how much the Rig Veda has in common with other ancient religions.
Oh, give me an example.
Okay.
I love finding those connections across cultures.
Well, the Rig Veda is polytheistic, meaning they had many gods.
Okay.
One of their most important gods was Indra, the storm god, similar to Zeus in Greek mythology or Thor in Norse mythology.
Oh, interesting.
He was a powerful warrior, often depicted battling chaos to create order.
So this idea of a storm god who establishes order is something we see across different cultures? That's fascinating.
It really is. There's even a story about Indra separating the earth and sky,
Okay.
which is similar to creation myths from other cultures. The Rig Veda also talks about a drink called soma,
Okay.
which was used in rituals and had hallucinogenic properties.
Interesting.
Other cultures had similar drinks like homa in Zoroastrianism.
Okay.
It shows how these ancient cultures, though geographically distant, shared some common ideas. But here's where it gets interesting. Even in the Rig Veda, we start to see some skepticism about the gods.
Wait, skepticism. They were questioning their own beliefs back then. That's pretty surprising.
It is.
What sparked these doubts?
Well, some hymns express doubts about the power of Indra, which is pretty bold for such an early text.
Okay.
But the skepticism becomes even more pronounced in the Hymn of Creation, a fascinating poem that tries to explain the origin of the world not through divine intervention, but through natural processes.
Okay, let's unpack this hymn of creation. You're saying it goes against the traditional creation myths where a god creates everything. What does it say instead?
It starts with the idea of a primordial state of nothingness, a void where even non-existence didn't exist.
Right.
They imagine this void as a vast expanse of water shrouded in darkness.
Okay.
And then, get this, the world arises from this formless void through the power of heat.
Heat. So no divine spark or word from God, but heat is the creative force.
Right.
That's pretty radical.
And then the hymn introduces this idea of desire as the primal seed of mind.
Okay.
It suggests that desire was what spurred consciousness into being. It's
Yeah.
like this primordial urge to exist was the catalyst for the emergence of life and consciousness.
I can see how this hymn might have rattled some cages back then.
Yes.
It challenges some fundamental assumptions about creation and the role of the gods.
Exactly. What's even more interesting is that the final verses of the hymn question whether even the gods know the true origins of the world.
Wow.
It's a remarkable statement of humility and intellectual honesty for a text that's thousands of years old.
It's like they're acknowledging the limits of human knowledge and even divine knowledge.
Exactly.
So they're paving the way for philosophical inquiry.
That's exactly it. But before we move on to those philosophical developments, there's another crucial concept we need to explore. Rita.
Rita. Tell me about it.
Rita is the concept of cosmic law or order, a fundamental principle that governs the entire universe. Think of it as a blueprint for moral conduct and social harmony.
So it's like the laws of physics,
Yes.
but applied to ethics and social order.
Yeah.
Did everyone follow this, Rita?
It was more like an ideal that they strived for. In later Indian thought, this concept evolved into what we know as Dharma.
Dharma. Yes, I've heard of that.
Right.
It's often translated as duty, right? Like fulfilling your obligations in life.
That's part of it.
Okay.
But it's a much bigger concept.
Yeah.
Dharma encompasses ethical principles, social obligations, and even the laws of nature.
Right.
It's about living in accordance with the cosmic order, playing your role in the grand scheme of things.
That sounds like a pretty conservative worldview compared to like some ancient Greek philosophers who encouraged questioning everything.
That's a great observation. The Indian conception of cosmic law, unlike in ancient Greece, was inherently conservative. It prescribed a specific social hierarchy with Brahmins at the top, which tied back to the idea of fulfilling one's dharma. Challenging your place in the caste system would be seen as disrupting the cosmic order itself.
Wow.
And that brings us to another important concept tied to both the caste system and this idea of cosmic order: sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Okay, color me intrigued.
Yeah.
How did they view sacrifice?
The hymn of the primeval man in the Rig Veda offers some clues. It tells the story of Purusha, the cosmic man, who sacrifices himself to create the world.
So creation itself arises from self-sacrifice.
Yes.
That's a powerful image. What does that have to do with the caste system?
Well, the hymn links this cosmic sacrifice directly to the emergence of the caste system. It says the different castes originated from different parts of Purusha's body.
Interesting.
For example, Brahmins came from his mouth, Kshatriyas from his arms, Vaishyas from his thighs, and Shudras from his feet.
Wow. So their entire social structure was presented as a consequence of this primal sacrifice.
Right.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
And later texts, the Brahmas, went even further. They argued that because the world was created through sacrifice, it needed constant ritual reenactments of this sacrifice to keep existing.
So it wasn't just about pleasing the gods. It was about maintaining the very fabric of reality through rituals.
Exactly. They believed rituals had a real impact on the cosmos. This is where the Brahmins really solidified their power.
Okay.
Because they were the ones who knew how to perform these elaborate rituals correctly.
Right.
The hymns, the chants, the offerings, it was all a closely guarded secret.
It's like they had a spiritual monopoly.
Yes.
This knowledge gave them immense power and authority.
Precisely. But, where there's power, there's often pushback.
Our source material also talks about growing skepticism towards the Brahmins and their rituals.
Really? So people were already questioning the authority of the religious elite back then. What form did this skepticism take?
That's where we begin to see the seeds of the Upanishads, a collection of philosophical texts that challenge many of the traditional Vedic ideas.
Interesting.
They reflect growing disillusionment with the focus on elaborate rituals and the perceived greed and power-mongering of some Brahmins.
It was like a spiritual counterculture was emerging.
It was.
So they were looking for a different path.
They were. This movement drew upon asceticism, the practice of renouncing worldly pleasures to focus on spiritual liberation. Do you remember the Munis mentioned in the Rig Veda?
Vaguely. Weren't they like wise men who lived in the forests?
Yes. The Munis were these shamanistic figures who sought spiritual knowledge through practices like meditation and isolation. They were seen as having a direct connection to the divine.
Which bypassed the need for all those elaborate rituals and the priests who performed them.
I see. So the Upanishads offered an alternative path to spiritual liberation.
Yes.
Rooted in this tradition of asceticism.
Exactly. And this is where we finally see the emergence of the concepts of karma and reincarnation.
Ah, finally. But wait, you're telling me these ideas weren't part of the original Vedic worldview?
It's true.
They came later, with the Upanishads.
It's a fascinating example of how religious ideas can evolve.
Yeah.
And the way these concepts were introduced is quite intriguing.
Ooh, intriguing. You've got to tell me more.
Well, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the most important Upanishads, describes how the knowledge of karma and reincarnation was initially revealed in secret. It tells the story of the sage Yajnavalkya, who refused to discuss these concepts publicly.
Wow, the secrecy. Were these ideas considered dangerous or something?
It's not entirely clear, but there are a few possible explanations. One is that these ideas challenged the Brahmins' authority, which rested on their ability to perform rituals.
Right.
Karma and reincarnation suggested that true liberation came from within, through individual actions and self-realization, not through those external ceremonies.
So it was a subversive spiritual movement, spreading its teachings in secret.
Exactly. Another possible reason for the secrecy might have been to protect this knowledge from people who weren't ready for it. This idea of certain teachings being harmful, if not approached with the right preparation, is common in many mystical traditions.
It's like giving someone a powerful tool before they know how to use it. Okay, so enough with the buildup.
All right.
Tell me, what did they believe about karma and reincarnation?
They believed that karma, which literally means action, determined what happened to you after death.
Right.
Every action, thought, and intention creates a karmic residue that influences your future rebirths.
So good actions lead to good rebirths, and bad actions lead to, well, not so good rebirths. It's like a cosmic system of justice where the consequences of your actions follow you from one life to the next.
Exactly. And this cycle of rebirth continues until you achieve liberation, or moksha, which means escaping this endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Wow, that's a lot to process. But what was the ultimate goal of this whole reincarnation thing? Was it just about getting better rebirths?
No, the ultimate goal was to realize your true nature, your identity with Brahman.
Brahman. Isn't that the same term they use for the cosmic power they invoked in those elaborate rituals?
Yes, but in the Upanishads, the meaning of Brahman changes. It's no longer just the force behind rituals. It becomes the ultimate reality, the ground of all existence, the source of all consciousness.
So by realizing your identity with Brahman, you're merging with the universe itself. You're transcending your individual ego.
Exactly.
How did they think you could achieve this state of liberation?
Through knowledge. They emphasized understanding the true nature of reality and the self. Meditation, self-reflection, and guidance from a wise teacher. Were all seen as crucial tools on this path.
So it wasn't just about blindly following rituals or racking up good karma. It was about inner work, about really understanding the nature of existence and yourself.
Exactly. And that emphasis on self-knowledge really sets the Upanishads apart from earlier Vedic thought. It's a shift from outward rituals to an inward journey of discovery.
That's fascinating. So they integrated this new understanding of the self, karma, and reincarnation into their existing beliefs. It's like they gave the old system a whole new meaning.
That's a great way to put it. It's not that they rejected everything from before, but they reinterpreted it through this new lens of spiritual insight.
Speaking of reinterpreting things, the source material mentions an intriguing story about Shvetaketu and a Kshatriya king. Why is this story so important?
The story of Shvetaketu and King Pravahana Jayavali.
Yes.
It's a classic example of how the Upanishads taught their ideas. It beautifully illustrates their understanding of reincarnation and the soul's journey.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me the story.
Shvetaketu is this young Brahmin who goes to King Pravahana Jayavali to gain knowledge.
Okay.
But the king, instead of just giving him information, challenges him with questions about the afterlife.
What kind of questions?
He asks things like, where does a person go after death? How do the heavens not get overcrowded with souls?
Okay.
And how can one attain to the world of Brahman?
Okay, so some big questions.
Big questions.
Yeah.
And Shvetaketu, to his embarrassment, can't answer any of them.
So the king is showing up this young Brahmin and exposing the limitations of his traditional knowledge.
Yes. Shvetaketu, humbled by this experience, goes back to his father, a respected sage, and complains about the king's arrogance. But his father, surprisingly, praises the king.
Oh, wow.
He reveals that the knowledge King Pravahana possesses has never been known to Brahmins before.
Hold on. So this king, a Kshatriya, has knowledge that's unknown even to the highest Brahmin priests. That turns the traditional hierarchy upside down.
It does. And it highlights the Upanishadic idea that spiritual truth can be found in unexpected places.
Wow.
Not just within a specific caste.
Okay, I need to know.
Yeah.
What does the king actually teach Shvetaketu? What are these secret teachings about the afterlife?
He reveals this fascinating cosmology, explaining how the soul travels through different realms after death. The path depends on your actions and your understanding.
Okay.
The king describes a journey through the world of the fathers, the moon, the world of the gods, and finally to the world of Brahman.
It sounds like a complex spiritual roadmap. What determines which path you take on this journey?
The king says it depends on your level of knowledge and how attached you are to worldly desires.
Okay.
Those still clinging to material things get pulled back into the cycle of rebirth, while those who've achieved true knowledge and detachment reach the world of Brahman, where there's no return.
So it's not enough to be a good person or perform rituals.
Right.
It's about understanding the true nature of reality and breaking free from the illusion of separateness.
Exactly. This story really drives home the Upanishadic emphasis on knowledge and self-realization as the keys to liberation.
It's a powerful message. It's amazing how this story challenges the traditional power dynamics, putting spiritual authority in the hands of a Kshatriya king, not a Brahmin priest. We've talked about the soul's journey.
Yeah.
But our source material also dives into how the Upanishads approach the concept of the self.
Okay.
What can you tell us about that?
The Upanishads offer a variety of perspectives on the self, which shows just how rich and complex their philosophical exploration was.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all definition of the self.
That's right. Some texts, like the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, describe the self as a traveler moving between worlds.
Okay.
Someone who experiences both waking life and dreams, and ultimately seeks union with Brahman.
So our daily life, our dreams, even our deep sleep,
yes,
it's all part of this larger journey of the self.
Precisely. And the Upanishad suggests that understanding these different states of consciousness can help us understand the true nature of ourselves.
And what about other interpretations? How else did they think about the self?
Other Upanishads, like the Chandogya Upanishad, focus on the self as a source of bliss, as the embodiment of pure consciousness. They suggest that turning inward and quieting the mind allows us to experience this blissful state, our true nature.
It sounds like it's not just about traveling through different realms, but also a journey into ourselves.
Exactly. This inward journey is often described as peeling away layers of identification, like with our body, our senses, our mind, until we reach the core of pure awareness. That's the true self.
This reminds me of the 5 sheaths of the self described in the Taittiriya Upanishad.
Yes.
Remind me what those are all about.
Of course. The Taittiriya Upanishad describes the self as being enveloped by 5 sheaths. The food sheath, which is our physical body. The breath sheath, which is our life energy. The mind sheath, encompassing thoughts and emotions. The intellect sheath, covering knowledge and understanding. And finally, the bliss sheath, which is pure joy and contentment.
It's like the self is made up of these layers, like a Russian nesting doll, with each layer containing a deeper, more essential aspect.
That's a fantastic analogy. The Upanishads suggest that understanding these sheaths and their relationship to the true self can free us from suffering and help us achieve true happiness.
So are these sheaths connected to meditation in any way?
Absolutely. The Taittiriya Upanishad actually outlines a meditation practice where you focus on each sheath progressively, starting from the outermost and moving inward.
Interesting.
It's like systematically withdrawing your attention from the more superficial parts of yourself until you experience that core of pure awareness, the bliss sheath.
Wow. It's amazing how they turned these abstract ideas into practical techniques for self-transformation.
It is. This integration of theory and practice is a hallmark of the Upanishadic tradition. But remember, as with any deep philosophical exploration, there were moments of profound challenge and paradox. One of the most intriguing figures in this regard is Yajnavalkya, the sage we discussed earlier, who revealed the secrets of karma and reincarnation.
Ah, yes. What philosophical curveballs did he throw our way?
Well, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, he makes this mind-boggling argument. He suggests that the true self, the knower, can't actually be known.
Wait, what? If the self is the knower, how can it not be known? Isn't that contradictory?
It is, and it's a paradox that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. What Yajnavalkya is getting at is that the true self is the subject of experience, not the object. The moment you try to grasp it, define it, make it an object of knowledge, it slips away.
So the true self is this elusive, ever-present awareness that we can't quite pin down with thoughts or words.
Exactly. This argument set the stage for centuries of debate and exploration in Indian philosophy.
Wow.
Different schools offered their own interpretations of this profound paradox.
Wow. What an incredible journey.
I know.
We've gone from the origins of the caste system to the mind-bending concept of the unknowable self.
Yeah.
And along the way, we encountered skepticism towards established beliefs, alternative paths to liberation, and even the emergence of karma and reincarnation.
It is fascinating.
My brain is definitely feeling full right now.
I can imagine. It's a lot to take in, but we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore in the Upanishads and beyond.
I can't wait to dive deeper. But before we do, let's pause here and give everyone a chance to catch their breath. Join us in part 2 as we continue exploring the fascinating evolution of Indian thought.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the origins of Indian thought. Before we pause, we were discussing the Upanishads and their revolutionary ideas about the self, karma, and reincarnation. Now let's explore how these abstract concepts were put into practice.
I'm all ears. The source material mentions yoga. Is this the same yoga with the physical postures and breathing exercises that's so popular today?
Not quite. While physical postures were a part of it, yoga in the Upanishads was a much broader practice. It involved techniques for calming the mind, controlling the senses, and ultimately realizing your true nature.
What role did mental discipline play in achieving liberation, according to the Upanishads?
Mental discipline was key. The Katha Upanishad describes a process where you withdraw your senses from external distractions. Calm your mind and focus your intellect on the self.
That sounds pretty challenging. Was this something everyone was expected to do, or was it more for dedicated spiritual seekers?
Yoga was seen as a path for those serious about spiritual liberation. It required discipline, dedication, and guidance from a teacher. But the Upanishads emphasize that this path was open to anyone, regardless of their social status or caste.
So in a way, it democratized spiritual practice. It challenged the idea that liberation was only accessible through those elaborate rituals performed by Brahmin priests.
Exactly. Yoga offered a more direct path, one that focused on personal effort and inner transformation.
It's amazing how the Upanishads introduced these radical ideas while still working within the existing religious framework. They also talk about Brahman, right? Wasn't Brahman that cosmic power invoked in the Vedic rituals?
Yes, but as we discussed earlier, the concept of Brahman evolved in the Upanishads. It became the ultimate reality, the ground of all existence.
Right. Our source material mentions that Brahman is described as both impersonal and personal. How do they reconcile those two seemingly contradictory ideas?
That's one of the most fascinating and complex parts of Upanishadic thought. Some texts, like the Chandogya Upanishad, emphasize the impersonal nature of Brahman. They describe it as pure consciousness, beyond any limitations or attributes.
So kind of like this universal energy field connecting everything.
Yes. But then other Upanishads, like the Katha Upanishad, introduce a more personal aspect to Brahman. They describe it as being, a cosmic self. With qualities like knowledge, bliss, and even a will.
It's like Brahman has two sides. The impersonal ground of all being, and this cosmic personality that's somehow involved in how the universe works.
That's one way to understand it.
Yep.
And this duality gave rise to different schools of thought within Hinduism.
Okay.
Some focused on the impersonal aspect of Brahman, while others focused on the personal aspect.
It's incredible how one concept can lead to so many different interpretations.
It is.
But even with this diversity, they all seem to agree that liberation comes from realizing your identity with Brahman.
Yes.
Regardless of how you view it.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway from the Upanishads. But the source material also mentions new religious movements emerging around this time, specifically the cults of Shiva and Vishnu. What's the significance of those?
Yeah, I was curious about that too. It seems like a big shift from what we've been talking about so far.
It was the rise of Shiva and Vishnu worship represents a shift from the Vedic focus on ritual sacrifice to a more personal and devotional approach to spirituality.
So it's less about formal ceremonies and more about a direct connection with the divine, more relatable for the average person maybe.
You could say that these movements were deeply connected to existing folk traditions and beliefs, offering a more accessible form of spirituality for the masses.
What can you tell me about Shiva? He's often depicted as a pretty intense deity, right?
He is. Shiva, originally known as Rudra in the Vedas, was associated with destruction and transformation. He embodied both the terrifying and awe-inspiring aspects of nature.
So a force of nature that destroys and regenerates.
Exactly. It's interesting that Shiva became the patron deity of ascetics. His wild, untamed nature resonated with those who wanted to renounce worldly attachments and embrace a life of spiritual discipline.
Even though he represented destruction, he was also seen as a guide for those seeking liberation.
Yes. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad suggests that Shiva can be known through bhakti, which is loving devotion. This idea of surrendering to a personal god became incredibly influential in later Hinduism.
Interesting. What about Vishnu? What was his role in all of this?
Vishnu, who was originally a sun god in the Vedas, evolved into a benevolent deity associated with preservation and protection. He represented a more gentle aspect of the divine, offering grace and compassion to his devotees.
So you have Shiva representing destruction and transformation.
Yes.
And Vishnu representing preservation and protection. Were these two cults competing with each other?
Not necessarily. They offered different paths, appealing to different temperaments and spiritual needs.
Did these movements clash with the more traditional Vedic practices?
There was definitely some tension. The growing popularity of Shiva and Vishnu worship posed a challenge to the authority of the Brahmins. But our source material mentions that there were also attempts to integrate these new movements into the existing religious framework.
So they tried to blend the old with the new. How did they do that?
Texts like the Kalpa Sutras tried to create a more unified and cohesive religious system. They outlined guidelines for behavior, rituals, and social obligations, incorporating both Vedic traditions and the emerging practices associated with Shiva and Vishnu.
So a mixing of Vedic tradition and these new devotional practices.
Exactly. And this blending continued in later Hinduism as Shiva and Vishnu became central figures in the Hindu pantheon. Their stories and myths became woven into the rich tapestry of Indian mythology.
It's fascinating how Hinduism was able to embrace such a wide range of beliefs and practices. It speaks to its adaptability and enduring appeal, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But even as these devotional movements were flourishing, philosophical inquiry continued. The Upanishads laid the groundwork for centuries of debate and exploration.
So the Upanishads weren't just a historical moment. They were a catalyst for this ongoing philosophical exploration.
Exactly. They provided the essential texts, the key questions, and the conceptual tools that shaped Indian philosophy for centuries to come.
Okay, so we have these two parallel developments, devotional movements and philosophical inquiry. Where does the Bhagavad Gita fit into all of this?
The Bhagavad Gita. It's one of the most beloved and influential texts in Hinduism. And it beautifully reflects this merging of devotionalism and philosophical insight.
It's interesting that it's part of the Mahabharata, that epic story about warring families. How does a philosophical text end up in a story about a war?
That's what makes the Bhagavad Gita so unique. It's a philosophical dialogue that happens right on a battlefield in the middle of a moral crisis. The main character, Arjuna, is a warrior facing a difficult decision. He turns to his charioteer, Krishna, for guidance.
And Krishna is actually an avatar of Vishnu, right?
That's right. Their conversation explores themes of duty, action, and the nature of the self. It's a text that speaks to the human condition, offering guidance on how to live a meaningful life even when facing challenges.
It sounds like it has a lot to offer. What are some of the key takeaways from the Bhagavad Gita?
One of the central teachings is the idea of acting without being attached to the results of your actions. It's about doing what's right, fulfilling your dharma, without being driven by selfish desires or expectations of rewards.
So doing your duty for its own sake, not for personal gain.
Precisely. The Bhagavad Gita also emphasizes bhakti devotion to Krishna as a path to liberation. It suggests that through surrender to the divine, you can transcend the limitations of your ego and experience a state of blissful union.
So it brings together those two strands we've been talking about, the philosophical insights of the Upanishads and the devotional fervor of these new religious movements.
Exactly. The Bhagavad Gita became a cornerstone of Hindu thought. It offered a practical and accessible path to liberation that resonated with people from all walks of life.
It's amazing how a conversation on a battlefield could have such a profound and lasting impact.
It really is. And the Bhagavad Gita reminds us that profound ideas can emerge in the most unexpected places.
This is incredible. We've covered so much ground already. From the ancient hymns of the Rig Veda to the philosophical depths of the Upanishads, the rise of devotional cults, and the timeless wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita. It's amazing to see how these ideas developed thousands of years ago are still relevant today.
It speaks to the enduring power of the human search for meaning and purpose. We started this deep dive exploring the origins of caste, karma, and reincarnation, and we've uncovered this incredible tapestry of beliefs.
It really is.
Practices and philosophical insights.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. What stands out to you from everything we've discussed so far?
For me, it's the Upanishads and their revolutionary ideas about the self and the nature of reality. They challenged the status quo, offering a new path towards spiritual liberation that emphasized inner transformation and a direct connection with the divine. They set the stage for centuries of philosophical exploration and debate, and their influence continues to this day.
I agree. It's remarkable how they introduced such radical concepts like the unknowable self and the idea that true liberation comes from within. And what's even more impressive is how they integrated these philosophical insights into practical techniques like yoga and meditation.
Exactly. They didn't just talk about these ideas, they provided a roadmap for how to experience them directly.
This has been such a fascinating journey. What other questions does this raise for you?
I'm curious about how these ancient ideas influenced the development of other Eastern philosophies and religions. Did they travel beyond India? And how have they shaped our modern understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the search for meaning? These are questions I'd love to explore further.
I'm with you there. This deep dive has definitely sparked my curiosity. It's amazing how much depth and wisdom these ancient texts hold.
And the great thing is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to discover and unpack.
I can't wait to continue this exploration. But for now, let's take a moment to digest all this incredible information. Join us in part 3 as we wrap up this epic journey through the origins of Indian thought. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the origins of Indian thought. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. It's been quite a journey, from those early Vedic hymns and the emergence of the caste system all the way to the profound insights of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita.
I'm still amazed by how these ancient texts speak to universal human questions about life, death, and the search for meaning. You know, the source material also mentions some later developments in Hinduism that I'd love to explore, like the Puranas and the growing importance of temples. How did these shape the religious landscape?
Those are great questions to wrap up with. The Puranas, which emerged around 400 to 600 CE, represent a fascinating shift in how people engaged with their faith. Think of them as collections of myths, legends, and moral teachings, almost like an ancient version of storytelling.
So they took those complex philosophical ideas we've been discussing and made them more accessible to the average person through stories.
Exactly. They brought those abstract concepts to life through relatable characters and vivid narratives. The Puranas became incredibly popular, spreading through oral storytelling before they were eventually written down in Sanskrit.
It's like they turned philosophical treatises into epic tales. Did this shift towards storytelling change how people experience their faith?
It absolutely did. The Puranas played a key role in the rise of temple worship, which became central to Hinduism during this period.
So we see a movement away from those home-based rituals of the Vedic period towards grand public spaces dedicated to the divine.
Precisely, temples became hubs for communities, places for festivals, gatherings, and elaborate rituals. And these rituals were often dedicated to specific deities, especially Shiva and Vishnu, who we discussed earlier.
It sounds like the rise of temple worship went hand in hand with the growing popularity of those devotional cults.
That's right. The Puranas helped to popularize these deities and their stories, providing a rich mythological background for the rituals and practices that took place in the temples. It created this vibrant and engaging religious experience that anyone could participate in.
So Hinduism developed to encompass both the philosophical depth of the Upanishads and the vibrant storytelling and devotional practices found in the Puranas and temple worship.
That's a great way to put it. It's this incredible combination of intellectual exploration and emotional engagement that makes Hinduism such a multifaceted and enduring tradition.
You know, the source material also mentions that new philosophical schools emerged that drew inspiration from the Upanishads. One example is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. What can you tell us about that?
Shankara, who lived in the 9th century CE, is considered one of the most important figures in Hindu philosophy. He developed and popularized Advaita Vedanta, a school of thought that emphasizes the non-dual nature of reality.
The non-dual. That sounds pretty complex. What does that mean exactly?
It means that ultimately there's only one reality. Brahman and everything else, including our individual selves, is an illusion.
So we are all just part of this one ultimate reality, like drops in the ocean of Brahman.
That's a great analogy. Shankara drew upon the Upanishads, particularly Yajnavalkya's teachings about the unknowable self, to develop his philosophy. He argued that our true self, Atman, is identical to Brahman, and liberation comes from realizing this unity.
That's a mind-blowing concept. Are you saying that the world we experience, including ourselves, is just an illusion?
It's not that the world isn't real, but our perception of it as separate from Brahman is an illusion. Shankara called this illusion Maya, and he believed it keeps us trapped in this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
So according to Shankara, liberation comes from seeing through this illusion and recognizing our oneness with Brahman.
Exactly. Shankara's philosophy was incredibly influential. It inspired countless spiritual seekers and shaped the development of other schools of thought within Hinduism.
Wow. This deep dive has been an incredible journey. From the ancient hymns of the Rig Veda to the rise of devotional cults, the profound wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, and the mind-bending philosophy of Shankara, it's amazing to see how these ideas born thousands of years ago continue to resonate with people today.
It's a true testament to the enduring power of ideas and that deep human desire to understand ourselves and our place in the universe. You know, we started this deep dive with your interest in the origins of caste, karma, and reincarnation, and look where we ended up.
I know. We've uncovered a whole tapestry of beliefs, practices, and philosophies. What are your biggest takeaways from this deep dive? What has resonated with you the most?
For me, it's the incredible evolution of thought we see within Hinduism. It's a tradition that embraces diversity, that isn't afraid to challenge its own assumptions and explore new ideas. From the early emphasis on ritual and sacrifice to the later focus on personal devotion and inner transformation, it's a tradition that has constantly adapted and evolved while staying true to its core values.
I completely agree. And I think it's that adaptability and openness to new perspectives that has allowed Hinduism to thrive for thousands of years. It's not a rigid or static system, but a living, breathing tradition that continues to inspire and guide people on their spiritual journeys. What questions has this deep dive sparked for you?
Well, I'm wondering how these ancient ideas influenced the development of other Eastern philosophies and religions. Did they travel beyond India? And how do they inform our modern understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the search for meaning? These are just a few of the many questions that this deep dive has left me pondering.
It's wonderful to see how these ancient texts can spark our curiosity and inspire us to continue exploring. And that's what I love most about these deep dives. They're not just about learning facts, they're about igniting our imaginations and encouraging us to keep asking those big questions. What about you? What questions are you left with? What stands out to you the most from all that we've discussed?
The idea of the unknowable self really sticks with me. It's such a powerful concept, and it makes me think about the limits of human knowledge and the nature of consciousness. It's something I'll definitely be reflecting on further. What about you?
I think the story of Shvetaketu and the Kshatriya king is particularly powerful. It reminds us that spiritual truth can be found in unexpected places, and sometimes the most profound knowledge comes from those who are willing to challenge the status quo. This deep dive has been such an enriching experience, and I'm grateful to you, expert speaker, for guiding us through this fascinating exploration of Indian thought.
The pleasure was all mine. It's been a privilege to share this journey with you and our listeners.
And to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to continue exploring, keep asking questions, and delve deeper into the rich world of Indian thought. Until next time.